Trump's so-called peace summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. What was the end game when you look at the summit participation, the discussions there, and the outcome?
Well, to answer your question directly, the summit was the end game. Standing in front of a banner that reads Peace 2025 with Donald Trump flanked by the so-called Arab world and the so-called, or members of the so-called international community, who Trump humiliated one after another. That was the point. And Trump appears as though he has solved the most intractable problem in recent human history. And it gives the image of a resolution to the Israel-Palestine crisis, even though Netanyahu was not present. Netanyahu is now claiming, I couldn't be there because of Simchat Torah and the ultra-Orthodox members of my coalition. There was a Jewish holiday coming up, and so I couldn't be there. That's not why he was there. He was there because he didn't want to be forced into potentially Trump forcing him to shake hands with Mahmoud Abbas, which would tear into his coalition and would contain echoes of the famous, or I would say notorious, handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, which Rabin was assassinated for, and which Netanyahu incited. It helped incite the assassination. Netanyahu's whole coalition rests on his promise to obstruct a two-state solution, to prevent a Palestinian state, and actually to prevent peace. And Donald Trump could care less about addressing the real roots and actual causes of the conflict. He just wants to get a kind of diplomatic win. Steve Witkoff, who is his main negotiator on the issue of Israel-Hamas negotiations, as well as many other conflicts, essentially retired after the Sharm el-Sheikh summit. And so Trump has just put this all behind him. He is concerned primarily with his legacy. He did not get the Nobel Peace Prize and was obsessed with getting the Nobel Peace Prize to consolidate his legacy forever. So this was the next best thing. And as far as enforcing the ceasefire, well, we have to look at what Trump said in the Knesset. There are two parts to this. There was the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, which was just a PR exercise for Donald Trump, in which the so-called Arab states were convinced that they could actually exercise leverage along with Turkey over Trump, which has proven ridiculous again, or delusional again and again. And then there was the Knesset speech, where Donald Trump basically consolidated his legacy as the protector of Greater Israel and paid tribute to his top patron, the Israeli warlord Miriam Adelson, who is the heir to the fortune of casino baron Sheldon Adelson. And it was there that Donald Trump said, she's sitting there looking so innocent, but she's not innocent. She has $60 billion in the bank. And she was the most frequent visitor to the White House, along with her husband, Sheldon, who was very aggressive. I mean, it was kind of like a roast, but at the same time, he's paying tribute to her. And he's saying they basically controlled my entire policy outlook on the region. In fact, it was through Miriam Adelson's money that Donald Trump was bribed to relocate the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was an extremely provocative move that I think actually was a factor in October 7th, because it puts more pressure on the Palestinians of East Jerusalem. It invalidates a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem, and it puts more pressure on the Al-Aqsa compound, which is being constantly invaded by fanatical Israeli messianic religious nationalists, including Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. So Donald Trump does all that. He admits that it was because he was bribed. And then he says that Miriam Adelson was asked, he asked her, which country do you love more, America or Israel? And she didn't answer, and he knows it was Israel. So he acknowledges that he was basically bribed by an Israel first billionaire to wage political warfare on Palestinians and on the region on behalf of her country. Is this someone who is actually going to apply leverage to Israel to enforce a ceasefire that Israel is already, in just about 72 hours, violated in flagrantly provocative ways? I don't think so. So where is the counter pressure from Turkey, for example, from the Arabs who showed up at Sharm el Sheikh? The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia didn't go, or they didn't send leading figures. They just sent like lower level officials. I'm not seeing it. So again, I think this was an exercise in propaganda for Trump to complement a ceasefire, which is not peace. It is merely a pause.
Max, one of the things that has happened during the talks, during the negotiations between the United States and Arab states, we see four Qatari negotiators were somehow they passed away. I don't know what was the reason of that, and what do we know about that?
Well, I'll tell you the reason. We've been able to get an investigative team on the ground in Egypt, and they've been able to comb the country and question officials, and we know the answer. Actually, they just fell off a balcony, so I can't tell you. That's what I was told. Our team just fell off a balcony. I'm joking, obviously. It's impossible to know what's happening in Egypt. I mean, it's one of the most difficult places in the region for a journalist to operate. So I would have no way of knowing. This team of, I don't know if they were diplomats or security officials. I heard they were security officials. The official story is that their steering column broke in a Mercedes. It was like a Mercedes Sprinter, I think. This is a pretty well-built vehicle. So I'm not accepting the official story. And I mean, just think of all the times we've heard of activists and dissidents who fall off balconies in Egypt. It just happens again and again. It's like it's like gallows humor among Egyptians. Oh, he fell off the balcony. So no one can accept the official story. We have the background of Israel attempting to assassinate the Qatari negotiating team, which actually is one of the things that triggered Trump to make the one phone call, the only phone call that was needed to actually get to a ceasefire, something Biden refused to do, really demonstrating how much leverage the U.S. does have if it's willing to sideline the Israel first billionaires that control Congress and national campaigns. And Trump was willing to do that. So is this revenge somehow for the fact that the Hamas negotiating team was targeted in Qatar? Qatar forced Trump to elicit an apology from Netanyahu for that strike. Is this revenge for that saga by Israel? Is Israel trying to send a message to Qatar that we can still harm you in a third country? Or was another intrigue at play? I have no idea. I can only offer theories, but the official story in Egypt can never be trusted when there's an unusual death like this.
Donald Trump, when it comes to Brazil, for example, he wants to be tough. He tries to interfere in the internal policy of Brazil, siding with the former president of Brazil. But when you look at his performance in the Knesset, he was somehow humiliating his position, the position of the United States. He talked about his daughter moving from Christianity to Jewish, because of Israel.
Yep.
It's not because of she wants to be closer to her husband. It's all because of Israel. The way that he was playing the game. He asked the president of Israel to pardon Netanyahu. What was that? what can we what is, because we have to understand the reality of what's going on in the mind of the president of the United States, who really desperately wants the world to see him as a tough guy. But that wasn't Donald Trump in Israel.
Well, there are two issues there. One is Trump's personal sensibility, which makes him popular inside the United States. It's the sensibility of a casino owner and someone who grew up on his father's construction sites, hanging out with construction workers, who really likes to entertain his audience. And he would get up at casinos and introduce notable people. And he was he owned like a second-rate football league called the USFL, and he hung around pro athletes, and he just loves to get up there and make everybody laugh. It's sort of like an old school, almost like when the mafia owned Vegas, and they would just come out and, Bugsy and the guys would come out on stage with Dean Martin and the Rat Pack, and they would joke around in front of the audience. And at the same time, they would apply some very dirty tactics behind the scenes. He comes out of that world, and he's roasting his own daughter, and he has some contempt for her because she's sort of a liberal who likes to hang out in Aspen and Davos along with Jared. Jared suddenly materializes and makes her Jewish. She was actually converted through Chabad. They go to this elite Upper East Side synagogue that's sort of like where a lot of very powerful people go. So she got involved in a different power network than Trump and Trump Incorporated. And she's sort of involved in a kind of cult. And I think Trump realizes it, and he loves to humiliate people in public and entertain audiences. On the issue of Netanyahu's pardon, part of that comes from Trump's sensibility, because he's constantly and justifiably accused of corruption. And the corruption that we see in the United States makes the cases that Netanyahu's facing pale in comparison. I mean, one of Trump's underlings, Tom Homan, who's in charge of mass deportations, he just took a bag of cash from FBI agents, $50,000, in exchange for a bribe, like a naked bribe. This, should wind him up in prison. And Trump said he did nothing wrong. So Netanyahu is accused of taking champagne and cigars, about $130,000 worth, from his friends, including Miriam Adelson was someone who testified against him. And Trump's joking about it and saying, how is this corruption? I mean, the whole Trump family is dedicated to corruption. It's using power in order to profit, whether it's by trying to take over Greenland or launching a line of golden cell phones, Trump cell phones, that they try to sell to suggestible members of their base. And they use presidential influence to make money. They're doing meme coin rug pulls. They've got, while they're shifting crypto policy in favor of Donald Trump, it's next level corruption. So he's making light of that in a way, but he's also roasting Netanyahu. But finally, there is a clever piece to what Donald Trump is doing, because if Netanyahu is not pardoned, and it kind of took me too long to get to this point, so I apologize. But if Netanyahu is not pardoned, he is more likely to launch a war on Iran, because his coalition is more likely to fragment around the ceasefire, coming under pressure from the more extreme members. It's difficult for him to re-enter Gaza at this point. It will piss off Trump. So the best way for Netanyahu to unite his coalition and the Israeli public is by launching another war with Iran, and once again dragging the US in, unless he feels comfortable about leaving power and saying, hey, I was the longest serving Israeli prime minister in history. I managed to get our country through a very difficult existential war, and I'm not going to be prosecuted. If he's not pardoned, he's got to stay in power until his death. So I think that's the reason Trump said that. And it was in a way wise for Trump to do that, because Donald Trump is not going to do what's necessary, what Biden should have done, which is to bring Netanyahu down by applying enormous leverage and pressure that forces him into a situation where there's a ceasefire without total victory, which would have blown up his coalition and sent him back to court. But Biden was too much of a coward and too much of a subject of Israeli influence to do that, as even Kamala Harris is now saying in her own memoir.